Okay, guys, today we're going to be looking at the period after World War One, and we're also going to be looking at the rise of the dictators, which are going to occur after World War One as well. So let's dive into this lesson, and as always, let's look at these learning objectives. You might want to pause this so you can write these down. Again, these are our main things that we should know by the end of the lesson. So, what was life like after the war in Europe? What was it like after World War One? Next one is explain Stalin's role in the Soviet Union and what he does. Next one, explain Mussolini's rise to power. The next one is explain Hitler's rise to power. Explain Japan's rise to power. And then the last is explain what was happening in the U.S. during the 1920s and 1930s. So those are our learning objectives. If you need to pause the video to write those down, go ahead and do so at this time. If not, then we will move on. So after the war, again, most of Europe has been destroyed, which is going to lead to a lot of problems because most of their economies are wrecked as well, which in return is going to caused most of Europe to be in a depression right after World War One. Again, the economies of many European countries are struggling, and this leads to a depression. Of the countries that were the most heavily damaged and impacted was Germany, naturally. Not only did the damage impact German economy, but also the peace treaty and the Treaty of Versailles and the terms that Germany had to agree to with the reparations is going to really destroy the German economy. So most of the German economy is in shambles. Again, Germany has the burden of reparations. They end up with rampant inflation. Inflation, again, is when the prices of goods go up. There's some famine, a lot of people are starving, and of course, there's high unemployment. Germany has a huge resentment, of course, to the Treaty of Versailles. Again, it took away land from them, caused them to have to pay back reparations to the Allies, which was an enormous amount of money, and they had to take full responsibility of the war in the Treaty of Versailles through the War Guilt Clause. So the people of Germany will develop a hatred towards the Allied powers, especially France, Great Britain, and the United States, and their own government for putting them in such a bad situation. Of course, we looked at some pictures. Germany's money would become worthless. The German mark depreciates really, really bad, causes the value of the German mark to go down. And the Germans of course, didn't help themselves by printing more money than what they had to cover in their government. And of course, this leads to inflation. All of Germany's problems, of course, are going to open the door for Adolf Hitler. Hitler is going to promise the German people that he could restore them to greatness. He could improve the economy. He could bring back jobs. He could bring back the military. All of those were things that Hitler is going to promise. And of course, the German people were in such a desperate mode after World War One that they were willing to listen to just about anyone, regardless of their ideologies or their beliefs. One plan that was proposed to try to help Germany out was the Dawes Plan. This was a plan that was created in 1924 to try to ease the reparations on Germany, saying let Germany only pay what they could at the time. So the Dawes Plan did address the reparations and Germany's problems with paying back those reparations. The Treaty of Locarno also came out during the 1920s. This allowed Germany to eventually join the League of Nations. Remember, in the Treaty of Versailles, they were shut out. The only thing that Germany had to do in order to join the League was to recognize the borders that were set up with other countries by the Treaty of Versailles. The League of Nations was formed by the Treaty of Versailles. The only problem with it was that it was very weak. It had no enforcement powers. It had no army. And of course, one of the main people that had proposed the League of Nations was the United States. And the United States chose not to join the League of Nations. So again, the League of Nations extremely weak after the war. Eventually, it would be replaced by the United Nations after World War II. Again, some of the key vocab from this lesson: the reparations, inflation, League of Nations, Treaty of Versailles, Treaty of Locarno, the Dawes Plan. Those are all key vocabulary words that you should be familiar with. So let's look at Russia and what's going on. Last we talked about Russia, the revolution had taken place. Lenin had taken control, and Lenin rules over Russia up until 1924, and eventually these two guys are going to battle for power after Lenin's death in 1924. So let's talk about the Soviet Union. Again, Lenin took over after the Bolshevik Revolution and forms the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, which is the USSR or the Soviet Union. Lenin's going to initiate something known as the NEP, or the New Economic Policy, to help revive the Soviet economy. Again, he's going to move away from some of the nationalization of Soviet industry. So he's sort of loosening the strings a little bit on complete control of the government over industry. Lenin dies in 1924, and after his death, of course, this power struggle is going to happen. Rising out of this struggle is going to be the new leader of the Soviet Union. His name is Joseph Stalin. Stalin, of course, would assume control of the Soviet Union. One of the first things that Stalin did was to get rid of his political opponents through a purge. A lot of these people were executed. They were taken out in the woods and shot. Stalin made sure there was nobody that could oppose him. One of his main opposition people was Trotsky. Trotsky was Stalin's chief political opponent after Lenin's death, and Trotsky is going to flee once these political purges begin by Stalin. He's going to flee to Mexico City in 1940, only to be murdered in Mexico City as Stalin sent some of his people after Trotsky. So Trotsky was Stalin's chief political opponent after Lenin's death. Stalin begins a policy known as collectivization in agriculture. Collectivization, basically the government's going to take control of all of the farms. Again, collectivization, here's the definition up here for you, was when peasants were forced to give up their lands and go work on these huge, large collective farms that the government controlled. Stalin did not support Lenin's new economic policy, and he wanted a command economy where the government controlled most of the industry. Stalin starts an industrialization effort in the Soviet Union. This plan was implemented, was known as the 5-year plan. The 5-year plans focused on agriculture and industry and trying to modernize the Soviet Union. Industries such as steel, coal, and oil were focused on during these 5-year plans. These industries are often known as heavy industries. During 1932 to 1933, almost 10 million people would die in the Soviet Union from famine as those farms became part of the government. Some people, of course, lost their lives from starvation. Those who resisted Stalin and the government were sent into forced labor camps in Siberia. And then, of course, these purges or removals of anyone related to Lenin were taking place also during this time. A lot of these people were put on trial and eventually condemned to death. By 1934, 26 million farms had been collectivized by the Soviet government. Millions of people were sent and forced to labor camps known as gulags. Most of these gulags were in Siberia. It's very, very cold, very desolate, very remote. And when you were sent off to the gulag in Siberia, usually you never returned back to the Soviet Union. Again, some of the key vocab from this lesson: the new economic policy, collectivization, the 5-year plans, the gulags, what a purge is, command economy, and of course, Stalin's chief political opponent, Trotsky. Let's look at Mussolini's rise. In Italy, Mussolini would bring about a strong sense of nationalism in Italy after the war. Of course, nationalism, extreme pride in one's country. But Mussolini takes it one step further. He takes the idea of nationalism to an ultra-nationalism, which is called fascism, where the state or the country comes first over everything else, and nothing else matters. And that's what Mussolini did with Italy. Fascism is a very strong version of nationalism, where country comes first. Mussolini organized a military group called the Black Shirts. Black Shirts were his supporters. These Black Shirts are going to eventually overthrow the Italian government in 1922 when they marched on Rome. Mussolini would become Italy's new leader, and he would be called by the Italian people as El Duce. El Duce means the leader. Italy's first military move would be in Ethiopia in 1935, when it invaded that country mainly for its oil as they began to militarize. Okay, and some of the key vocab for Mussolini's rise are fascism, the Black Shirts, and El Duce. Make sure you know what those key vocab words are. All right, let's move on to Germany and Hitler. So Hitler's rise to power, of course, begins with all of the devastation that's going to be left behind by World War I. Reparations and a bad economy have the people of Germany struggling just to get by after the war. These conditions are going to allow the German people to listen to just about anyone who might and can offer change. That leader would emerge out of all of this, and that leader would be Adolf Hitler. Hitler promises the German people that things would change and he would restore Germany to greatness. Hitler joins a political party known as the German Workers' Party. Eventually, it's going to be named the Nazi Party or the Nationalist Socialist Party. Hitler realizes this party has many of the same ideas as he has. This party changes to the National Socialist Party or the Nazi Party. Hitler changes its name. Hitler attempts to overthrow the government in 1923, known as the Beer Hall Putsch. It is unsuccessful, and Hitler is going to be put into prison. He would stay in prison for a little while, and while he's in prison, he's going to write his manifesto, or his sort of like an autobiography, and his ideas and his beliefs. This book was known as Mein Kampf, which means my struggle. Mein Kampf expresses Hitler's plan for world domination and his extreme hatred for the Jews. Extreme hatred for the Jews is known as anti-Semitism. Definitely want to know that word. You might want to underline it in your notes. Eventually, Hitler's Nazi Party would become the largest political party in the German government. And by the 1930s, the Nazi Party began to dominate the German Reichstag. And the German Reichstag is sort of like our Congress or Parliament for Great Britain, but the Nazi Party is going to dominate. Hitler formed a military group known as the SA, or the Brown Shirts. These guys would carry out missions to intimidate and carry out violence against any of his political opponents and Jewish-owned businesses and the Jews. The German Weimar Republic was the government that was set up from 1927 to 1934 in Germany, and Hitler would overthrow the Weimar Republic and seize control in 1934. Hitler would assume full control of Germany when von Hindenburg, who was the president of the Weimar Republic, would be forced to resign as Hitler's party takes control of the German Reichstag, and von Hindenburg, of course, is going to die in 1934, which also was an easy route for Hitler to take over once von Hindenburg is out of the picture. In Mein Kampf, Hitler describes what he considers to be the master race. Blonde hair and blue eyes were considered superior over everyone else. This was known as the Aryan race, or the Aryans. Hitler believed that the Aryans needed more living space. This idea is called Lebensraum, and you definitely want to know what Lebensraum is. It's living space for the German people. And this is going to be one of the reasons that Hitler's going to use when he invades other other European countries. In 1935, Hitler passes the Nuremberg laws, where Jews weren't allowed to be German citizens or marry German people. In 1936, Hitler moves troops into the Rhineland. Remember, we discussed the Rhineland at the end of World War I. It was a demilitarized border along the French-German border. And of course, it was supposed to have no militaries in it. And of course, Hitler violates that in 1936. In World War I, the Treaty of Versailles said that no German troops could be in the Rhineland. And of course, Hitler goes against that. The French government or the League of Nations took any action to stop Hitler's movement of the military into the Rhineland. This idea is called appeasement. European nations did nothing and allowed Hitler to continue taking land. So appeasement means to giving in. In 1938, Hitler and the Germans invade Austria. They used something known as Anschluss. Most Austrians spoke German and welcomed becoming part of Germany. Of course, Hitler was Austrian, in case you did not know that. So the annexation of Austria was known as Anschluss, which occurred in 1938. But Hitler and the Germans were expanding, and the World War I treaty told them not to. And of course, Hitler is violating the Treaty of Versailles. And here's a picture of Austria, Vienna being the capital. Hitler's hatred of the Jews became evident with Kristallnacht, which is the night of broken glass. This occurs in 1938. Extreme violence was carried out against the Jews and their property. After taking Austria, Hitler wanted more. His next desire was the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia. The Czechs didn't want to give this area to Germany, nor did France or Russia, but Hitler does it anyway. And of course, the Sudetenland, and here's Czechoslovakia. The Sudetenland is this piece of land between Germany and Czechoslovakia. The British step in to offer peace to avoid war. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain meets with Hitler in Munich, Germany. This is the Munich Conference. They agree to give Hitler the Sudetenland as long as he agreed not to take any more land. Hitler has a promise, and he said that he is done with taking land. Of course, this conference was the Munich Conference. Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister who came up with the agreement, said that he had achieved peace in our time during the Munich Conference by getting Hitler to agree not to take any more land after the Sudetenland. But of course, Hitler's going to break his promise, and in March of 1939, Hitler would invade Czechoslovakia. So he goes back on his word. Hitler also made sure before he did anything else was that he signed an agreement with Stalin and the Soviet Union. Hitler knew that the Soviet Union could pose a problem for him, so he goes to Stalin and asks Stalin not to attack him. And they decide that they're going to invade Poland, and that Poland would be divided between the Soviet Union and Germany. So immediately after the Non-Aggression Pact was signed, Germany invaded Poland. France and Britain declared war on Germany, and World War II officially begins September 1st, 1939. Japan also plays a role. During this period, they had a long history of militarism. Remember, we talked about them with the Russo-Japanese War and how they had humiliated the Russians. They defeated Russia in 1905 in that war, and they felt slighted after the Treaty of Versailles because they actually helped the Allies out, and they didn't really get much respect or anything from the Treaty of Versailles. Japan, of course, lacked a lot of resources because it was an island, but they needed a lot of things to get their military up and going, and of course, they wanted to be along the same route as the United States and France and Great Britain. But they needed rubber, oil, and iron, and they sought to change that in 1931 when they invaded Manchuria in China. So they invade Manchuria in 1931. They eventually run the Chinese out, and Japan would start its march to take land and resources, taking over islands and land in Southeast Asia during the 1930s. Eventually, Japan would invade China in 1937. The United States would begin to issue embargoes against the Japanese, mainly with oil, because they knew that they needed that to fuel their military. This, of course, is going to upset the Japanese, and they would prepare to respond to the United States, which eventually comes on December the 7th, 1941, with the attack on Pearl Harbor. The military dictator named Hideki Tojo would emerge in Japan, and he would be the military dictator during World War II. For the United States, after the war, the U.S. returns to isolationism after World War I. They want to put World War I behind them. The U.S. would enter into a time known as the Roaring Twenties, which was a time of economic prosperity. Things were really going good for the U.S. But this period of prosperity is going to come to a screeching halt in 1929 with the stock market crash. This eventually leads to the Great Depression, which would consume the United States during the 1930s, which is why they weren't able to really assert themselves against Hitler or with the Japanese. The president during most of the Depression was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Roosevelt's plan to get the U.S. out of the Depression was called the New Deal. The New Deal brought in programs such as the CCC, the TVA, FDIC, Social Security, and the Workers' Progress Administration. So all of these programs were initiated under the New Deal. Due to the Depression, the U.S. was preoccupied with the problems of the Depression, while the problems in Europe began to grow. Okay, that's going to do it for this lesson. Hopefully, you were able to take good, copious notes. Go back and review your learning objectives and make sure that you can answer all of those, and start preparing for your next test or assessment, which will be coming up soon. And I hope you guys have a great and fantastic day. We'll catch you guys on the next one.